better we're going to be. Enough of my exhortation. Now I'll cede the podium to Braun, who is a consultant working with the Guardians. He's very well known as an ecologist and environmentalist. His experience at the Audubon of Martin County is equally well known. So to some extent I'm off the hook because he's so well known. I don't really need to say anything else. Thank you all.
Thank you, Peter, and it's good to see so many here. I'm very impressed with Maggie Herchella and others who can get up here and without any visual aids give an outstanding presentation. I'm not that good, so I've got a bunch of visual aids to try to help me, but I'm also a very visual learner. And so I'm hoping by having some slides up here and talking about some of these somewhat complex issues, it'll help things sink into you a little bit. Those of you who have been in attendance at these growth management forums in the past will remember that it was probably between 5 and 10 years ago, we had to activate the forces because there was a situation that required us to become more knowledgeable about wetlands, and at that time it was isolated wetlands. The powers that be in the county were saying at that time, well, they were being pressured to say, we cannot have continued growth within the urban area while still protecting those nasty little isolated wetlands. Some of them were only a half an acre or so in size. They're not really worth anything. So at that time I came and put together a presentation about the value of isolated wetlands, because indeed what makes an ecosystem work is not just those great big things like the Indian River Lagoon and the St. Lucie Estuary and great big wetlands like Palomar and Allapattah, but also the smaller wetlands of varying sizes. Those of you who are interested in seeing the wading birds out there, the herons and the egrets and the wood storks, know that what happens is that this time of year, as the dry season continues along, those big wetlands get smaller and smaller and smaller, and as they concentrate the fish, those wading birds can come in and feed very effectively and then go off and feed their young. So today's presentation is a little bit different because the buzzword that came to all of us about 18 months or so ago was delineated. The county was going through a process at that time, not dealing with the comprehensive plan, but rather the LDRs. And those of you who have been around Donna know well enough that the LDRs are the land development regulations. So the comp plan is up here and it has those broad goals that Maggie's trying to get back in there. But then the way those goals are implemented are through these things called LDRs. And the county was making a change and they were hoping it would slip by us, or we wouldn't be paying attention, or we wouldn't care enough, that we would pick up on them putting the little word in here about they were going to protect delineated wetlands. Well, it got me as an ecologist kind of fired up, and I talked with several of you, and ultimately they made some changes at the county commission over our objections. Sarah and Ed Fielding did an admirable job trying to prevent these changes from taking place, but unfortunately they did not. But I expect a lot of people got lost in that whole discussion. So my presentation here for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions and hopefully answers afterwards, is about wetlands and delineated wetlands. So yes, Donna, you can hit the lights for me. And I'll talk a little bit about overall the value of our wetlands. You see on my title slide here that we've got ecological kinds of things, groundwater recharge and habitat for birds and other wildlife, recreation. That's my uncle in there who's fly fishing with a big trout on the end. But also flood protection and water quality. So we're going to talk a little bit about these various attributes of wetlands. I don't want to make this too confusing, but the idea is to figure out all of those different attributes of wetlands and turn it into something that is understandable. So I've separated it into those economic, ecological, and social kinds of benefits or values. And to a varying extent, different wetlands provide those services based on their own unique feature. A small little isolated wetland is not going to provide much value as far as erosion control, but the wetland that filters the water between an urban area and the Indian River Lagoon or the St. Lucie estuary, that will have more of a value from that perspective. The same sort of thing. All wetlands are not created equal depending upon what your interest is. Some are more valuable than others. In the big picture, wetlands protection across the United States, and certainly here in Florida, is several different layers. The federal government has this program. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulates wetlands. And here at the state level, it's both the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, and the water management districts who regulate wetlands. And I say "or" because it's not really a duplicative process. There's about a 30-page memorandum of agreement between those agencies that says, depending on what kind of a project it is and where it is, which of those two state agencies will take the lead. I thought this was a good graphic to show how we compare with some of the other states in the country. Overall, we're doing pretty good as far as wetlands protection. And that's very critical because a significant proportion of the state of Florida is wetlands. Just because there is a wetland out there doesn't mean you can't do anything at all. Generally, it means you have to go through some sort of a permit process, and this is where it gets to be very different between Martin County's standard of wetland protection from those other counties in the state. So up there at the top is the comprehensive plan. There are certainly exemptions, things that we have no control over, but wetland impacts can take place. So I've listed some of those. Access is one. If you've got a lot and the only way to get to your building part in the middle of that lot is to go through a wetlands, well, the comp plan says we have to allow access to those lots that were platted back before 1982. Public utilities, there's some recognition that for long linear corridors of power lines and that sort of thing, you can't easily avoid wetlands. So there are some exemptions like that. One of Martin County's extra things, though, is we have these setbacks adjacent to the wetlands. We recognize that the wetland itself needs some protection. So depending on what kind of a project it is and where it's located, you've got to have this setback so that you don't adversely affect the wetland. And then here's one of the big things we're going to talk about today is this change that the County Commission adopted, the majority of the County Commission back a little while ago, for the purposes of regulating land use by governmental agencies in Florida. An area of land becomes a wetland upon delineation. So we're going to talk about what makes it delineation, or what makes a wetland get delineated. Here is the statewide definition of what a wetland is, and essentially it takes into account those three criteria that I've got at the bottom. Wetland vegetation, the state has this wetland plant list of several hundred species of plants, and they essentially say if there's a dominance of the plants that are on this list at your location, it's probably a wetland. But as we all know, things get messed up for one reason or another, so sometimes the vegetation isn't even there. You know, maybe somebody's come through and cleared the whole area. So there are provisions to look at the other factors that might have caused it to be a wetland even if the vegetation isn't present. So hydrology and soils are these other two criteria. As far as the wetland vegetation goes, there are things called wetland obligates. So vegetation that you would expect is going to always be in a wetland. Cypress trees, these are things that generally, to be healthy, require a hydro period. They like standing water for about 300 days out of every year. So those wetland obligates are definitely out there in the wetland. So my sort of representative picture is that pond lily out there. You're not going to see that in a dry area. But then there are also facultative wetland species. So my representative of that is this little pinwort. Some of you may recognize that. It even grows in your front yard if you're in kind of a low area. Or, naughty, naughty, if it's you, you overwater so much so that the pinwort grows. So it's a species that isn't necessarily in wetland, but it is representative of those areas. And then there's a third category here of plants that they call invisible. You can't even, you don't link them to either being present in the wetland or in the upland. Cabbage palm trees are a good example of that. Don't grow right in your front yard, or they'll grow out there right in the wetland next to a cypress tree. Brazilian peppers, certainly those bad boys will grow any place. They're very adaptable. The next thing that they look at as far as identifying a wetland is the hydrology. So let's say that the vegetation isn't there, or it's not telling you a clear signal. It's got some upland species and some wetland species. You look at indicators of the hydrology. So I've got some examples of that. Let's look up here on this cypress tree. You see that line across at the same height above the water level here on all those cypress trees. That's telling you what the high water table was during the wettest time of the year. That lichen cannot grow there. Well, likewise, this is a cypress tree also. You don't see the lichen line at all. This wetland has obviously dried out. The hydrology isn't as good, but it still has all those mosses. That's telling you, even though there's not standing water, there's, the soil is wet enough that it is still a wetland soil. But you can look at other things as well. Faunal evidence, this picture, if you can tell what it is right here, that's a mass of eggs of the apple snail, a great little freshwater plant or freshwater species that turns into the prey for the Everglades kite or the limpkin. One of the other criteria for wetland identification is wetland soils. And wetland soils are very difficult to deal with. You really need to be a wetland scientist to try to figure those out, but there is a handbook that helps take some of the mystery out of it. There are about 50 different types of soils in Martin County that are designated as hydric soils. Here's a generalized map showing the location of those different soil types in Martin County, with generally the darker green colors that you would expect here along our waterway are definitely wetland kinds of soils. Over there along the edge of Lake Okeechobee as well. But you see a lot of the green areas right in the middle of the county are wetland soils as well. So indeed, in a natural condition, before we had excavated the Okeechobee Waterway and the C-43 and all the various canals, a significant portion of Martin County was indeed wetlands. Some of the changes that we get in Martin County are, and other places as well, are indeed as a result of urbanization. Every time you take a lot and you put in a driveway or a storefront and a roof that collects water and takes it into a stormwater area, you affect the amount of percolation down through the ground into our underground aquifer. So this is just a series showing that the more development that you have on an individual tract, the less amount of percolation you get down into the soils. So we started up here in a natural area. You've got a fairly high amount of infiltration, recharging the aquifer. The more and more impermeable area, the less and less water goes down underground. And what that's important to us for is, for the most part, we get our drinking water from that superficial aquifer, that layer of fresh water right below the surface. Unfortunately, some of you have seen this graphic before showing that the superficial aquifer in our southern part of the peninsula here is indeed either running low or practically empty. So that is coming around back to all of us as we now have to start paying for our water through Martin County Utilities or other entities that are needing to drill deeper wells, and therefore they get into salt water, and you have to take the salt out of that to make it drinkable. So yes, indeed, we are in one of those areas where superficial wells are going dry. I don't want to give the idea that wetlands are only there in the center part of the county. I've got kind of a representative picture that shows them all over the place, from the mangroves up here in the eastern part of the county, the big representative areas that we have been very wise to purchase over the years. Those of you who have voted for our public land acquisition initiatives will be able to thank the Atlantic Ridge for some of our freshwater resources in the area between I-95 and the Turnpike and US 1. Certainly, Jonathan Dickinson has a wealth of wetlands, none of which, or very few of which, have ever been officially delineated. Those of you that know the wetland down here in Cypress Creek and in Palomar, huge areas of wetlands. Up in the Alapata Flats, this is an area that we used our tax money to go in with other agencies and purchase tens of thousands of acres to try to restore the hydrologic regime. I put this one in as well because many of you may not know that one of the Everglades restoration projects is underway right now. I was out back in December and they have begun a lot of the construction work to create this large series of both a reservoir and a stormwater treatment area where they're going to take water that comes out of Lake Okeechobee, run it through this whole system, and then hopefully discharge clearer water back into the C-44. 10,000 acres or so worth of property overall, going to be several feet deep, so ultimately, we don't talk about gallons of water for something like this, it's 40,000 acre feet of water. So a big element, but our big problem in much of Martin County in South Florida is indeed having enough area for water storage. Some of you may recognize this map. It is from the county and it shows different criteria for wetlands. There are wetland soils in the brighter green down here. NWI is the federal government has this program, the National Wetland Inventory. And so they look at not on the ground what's there, but certain criteria to tell us what's a wetland. And then the pink area is showing, here we go. This is the combination of wetland soils, the National Wetland Inventory maps, and satellite imagery, all dovetailing and being consistent that an area is wetland. Well, why is it important that we look at remote sensing like this? Well, it's because you have to have the approval of a property owner to go on the land to be able to determine if an area is a wetland or not. We have tried in various battles. Donna, several years ago, we were lobbying for an area having been cleared illegally. And I brought in aerial photos and we were showing drainage pictures and elevation information and all that. And the bottom line was they said to me, can you tell me that the species of plant that were in here before were on the DEP plant list or not? Of course I can't do that. So that's when it comes back to this issue of delineation having been very important. In Martin County, we identify or protect not only those wetland areas, but they have also identified wetlands of special concern. And you see them mapped out here as well. So what's all this business about delineated wetlands? Well, the delineation is a process to go through to actually identify on the ground exactly where the boundary is between an area that is wetland and it is not wetland. And it often is not a clear picture because, of course, you have a gradation between plants that are on the list are dominant and plants that are not on the list are dominant. And somewhere in there, there's going to be this gray area. But the bottom line is you've got to know exactly where the line is. And as I put here at the bottom, sometimes it's different. Sometimes the state's definition of where the wetland boundary is different than the federal government's definition. So I'm just going to walk you through a project that I was involved with recently. It is not in Martin County, so nobody has to be concerned about any kind of issues, but it's exactly what happens here when a wetland gets delineated in Martin County. This is a project that I did down in Palm Beach County. This is A1A, and this is their version of the Indian River, the intracoastal down there. And so you see from the aerial photo that there's different kinds of trees out here. Well, I was asked to determine where across here is the wetland boundary. Is it all the way up here, or is it just right here along the edge of the lagoon? So the process that one goes through for that is you look at what's there. And here are those great big mangroves, 30-foot tall red mangroves. Unquestionably, that is mangroves, or that is jurisdictional wetlands. Then as you start creeping up, the mangroves, the hydrology isn't there anymore, and so they fade out and you start getting other vegetation. So you start looking at the plants that are on this list. And ultimately, I needed to tie that pink ribbon on what I said was the exact boundary. Wetlands on this side and not wetlands on the other side. You have to then fill out these data sheets that ask you about indicators of the hydrology and the vegetation that's there, how many species are on the list and how many aren't. other kind of odd things that happened that I did this assessment. It was the week that Hurricane Sandy was going through. So definitely things were weird at that time. The water level was unnaturally high, but the process takes the variability out of that because you have to go in and look at was it a normal kind of a condition or not. The bottom line is I put together this map that shows, okay, this is the boundary of the wetland, and I had 50 little flags tied all the way around here, and some of this was real good mangroves over here, and it started to be transitional at other locations. And I filled out those data sheets, one for an area that was unquestionably in the wetland, one that was unquestionably out in a maritime hammock, and then one that was right on the borderline. It had some of the features and some of them were not there. So then the process is, I asked the Corps of Engineers to come out and sort of validate my work. Tell me, did I do this right, or do you have some problem with what I've got? And there is some subjectivity. We walked the Corps along my line, and ultimately they said, yep, I hit it on the nose. That doesn't always happen that way, but we hope to think that the environmental consultants in Martin County are doing the right thing, and we keep pushing Martin County's environmental lands reviewers to make sure that they're doing it the right way. So Martin County's comp plan does a much better job than most other counties in protecting wetlands. Our changes that were made by limiting the protection to just delineated wetlands was a horrendous thing. And unfortunately, there were only a couple of us that were there to protest it while they were talking about it. And so that's part of my interest in getting this information to you to realize how important it is. Because a relatively small percentage of the wetlands in Martin County have gone through this process of delineation. A property owner is not going to hire me or anybody else to come out and delineate the wetlands unless they have to. So in the big picture, Martin County's preserve areas now involve about 6,000 acres worth of wetlands that have been delineated. We probably have tens of thousands of acres out there that have not been delineated. And by the county making this change to take out the provision of non-delineated wetlands, we fear they have opened the gate to all kinds of nasty things going on. So Maggie is taking the lead here in the forefront of comp plan changes. We hope that one of the things that the new commission will do will be reevaluate this change that they made and go back in and try to do what Sarah and Ed Fielding were doing to say the wetlands are protected whether they are delineated or not. And when it comes time for LTA hearings and county commission meetings, hopefully I can count on you to come in and help me go to bat for making changes that are the correct ones. Donna, we could have the lights there. And if that prompted any questions, I will try to answer them. Boy, if it comes from Dick Roberts, I got to really be on my toes. He's a wetland guy from years back.
There's three very obscure publications we use, and then some of you probably don't even heard of them or know them. One is, of course, the Water Management Survey on isolated wetlands that Steve Molera did, who's now from Water Management District where he did all that work to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. That went through great moss collars, the fish, the plants, tons of other stuff, and the publication is probably 3 or 4 inches thick. And we use that constantly for isolated wetlands because it does have a listing of like what birds use that isolated wetlands and what worked and what did not work. So it's really good to say I base my research on that particular field of reference. The other thing is their EPA study that Lorraine I worked on, everybody else, and Peter Merritt did from the Planning Council. That has 100 wetlands in Martin County, mainly in the Santee wetlands that were delineated by RAP. And we actually went and did those. And those are kind of an evaluation system of, from 1 to 10. And we have very various evaluations of volumes that we use. And that's, at least have a form of reference, and you go out and say, okay, that's good. The book you use has a couple in John Dixon, wetland delineations, and the thing we just published on the Wasatches, facultative and an obligate species. And we based that on the fact that as the river is drying up, the upland species are moving in. You can actually document each species as it moves in, and we can actually see them move out as we provide more water. So there's a lot of neat research that we've done, especially in the Wasatch watershed, talking about wetlands. So we hope this is what people want to talk about.
Yep, thanks, Dick. He mentioned WRAP, that being W-R-A-P, a wetland rapid assessment process. Essentially, they don't want to pay me or other consultants the big bucks to go out and assess these wetlands in detail. So they have developed this process to go in and rapidly do it, where you have this checklist and you try to say, real quickly, you just walk through a wetland and such present or absent. And it does help indeed give a good indication. It doesn't get you normally to that point of identifying exactly where the boundary is, but it is helpful in identifying sort of the value of the wetland, what sort of condition it's in, and that sort of thing, when it gets into that next discussion about wetland compensation.
Greg, in a quick read of the statute on delineation, it appeared to say that if the soil could support vegetation, and they had cleared all the vegetation, that you could delineate. Is that correct?
Yes, for the Corps of Engineers, they say could support and in natural conditions does support. So yes, if somebody has done a
On the other
dastardly...
hand, if you dug it up and it's no longer there and the lake is 20 foot deep, it's pretty hard to delineate it.
No, because it will go from being a wetland of the U.S. or of the state to a waters of the state. So if you've taken a wetland and you've made it deeper, then it's unquestionably jurisdictional.
So it's now a rock pit instead of a wetland.
Yeah, but except in the odd situation like, can I say Lake Point? Because somebody's going to do it.
I'll defend.
In certain areas, there is that exemption that if a wetland or an area has been excavated out to turn it into a stormwater treatment type facility, it sort of gets reviewed separately. And part of that, the reason for that, well, they've been trying to consider various ways to use existing commercial or industrial kinds of waters for the good things that we like. You know, why not grow fish out there at the FPL, 6,000 acres of wetland? Well, they have to treat that differently because it really is a commercial or industrial type water. So similarly, they do things differently in those STAs. It is jurisdictional, but because the whole design of it is to cleanse the dirty water, they cannot apply the same sort of drinking water standards and protection that we might like to see.
But looking at an entirely different situation, if I own 2 acres up near the Jensen Savannas, and I went and dug a pond in my backyard where there was a wetland, you can't delineate that wetland anymore, can you? I mean, the pond may now be jurisdictional, but there ain't no wetland there anymore.
That's absolutely true, because for the most part, these wetland delineation regulations have you start at some named water body, like the Indian River Lagoon or the wetlands in the savannas, and then you follow either the open water or the dominance of wetland vegetation to your location. So yes, in your example right there, even if you're Jackie and you've got lossy ibis feeding in your front yard, which is great, if there is not a connection, a continuous connection of wetland plants, then the jurisdiction goes away. So yes, the borrowed pits, especially when they're real small in people's yards, are non-jurisdictional. Keith?
That relates to a question I have. In the old days, if you had a wetland that was a jurisdictional wetland by FWS, for all intents and purposes, that was the definition and minimum of what a wetland was. My question is, if, let's say a developer decides to hire some biased environmental assessor and says, no, that FWS data is wrong, it's actually much smaller, the delineation is much more compact. And the question is, can a delineation override a jurisdictional wetland and allow, let's say, a developer to encroach much more than the jurisdictional would allow?
The wetland boundary can indeed change over the years, so there is some rationale to reevaluating it. Generally, it doesn't change that much because what happens is, and this is why they look at soils and indicators of hydrology. If you have just a year or two of abnormally dry weather or abnormally high amount of rain, it may look like the wetland vegetation changes a little bit, but you look at the soils and that's going to give you a longer term indication. But there is a formal process for getting to what you're talking about, where a property owner can essentially get their delineation, their jurisdictional delineation approved. And normally you have to pay the state to come in and confirm that it is exactly where it is, and what they call it is a binding jurisdictional, and it is what it is, and you use that for the planning purposes. As opposed to, and that's part of what Maggie's trying to do, is take the subjectivity out of all this. You ought to be able to read in black and white what's going on and have everybody interpret it the same way. Well, because of that issue of wetland boundaries changing, they now have formalized that process for a binding jurisdictional. Okay, and I'm right at 3:30, so thank you.
Yeah. One more thing, which is, talking with county staff last week, they assure me that if you know of a wetland, that is a wetland, never mind if it's ever been delineated before, if somebody is in the process of destroying it, tell them it is a code violation under, the Martin County Comp Plan. It's a wetland.
And
It may be that the wetland LDR is very badly written, and it may be that it should not say every place it mentions wetland, delineated wetland, delineated. It's a wetland. How you delineate it is one issue. The fact that it's a wetland is a wetland. And so don't let anybody dig any up. We're supposed to be protecting it.
And if you see something like that going on that you think is not right, make the contacts. I have been up in the Sheriff's Department helicopter looking over with the code enforcement guy in the helicopter right next to me, evaluating those things that don't quite look right. And it takes all of us kind of pushing the right buttons to make sure that those things do get looked at, because often, most people wouldn't clear anything right out in clear view, but they're going to remove or dig something way back there where they think nobody's going to see them. So yes, it takes everybody's eyes and ears to keep everybody honest. Thank you.